In your book on page 72, it talks about secular music that's going on during the Gothic and medieval periods. And it talks about, in the first paragraph, says wandering musician entertainers who traveled from place to place singing songs and reciting poems and even exhibiting trained animals. If you think of these sort of like a cross between a small circus and gypsies, that would not be too far off the mark. They were welcomed into castles and villages and things because they would travel from place to place and bring entertainment and diversion and information and gossip about the places that they went to. That being said, they were still regarded somewhat as gypsies in that they weren't trusted. They were considered lower class. They're just entertainers, and that's all they were. And these are not primarily musicians. Like I said, they're more like a circus, but music would be a part of that, and they would sing songs. They don't give them the name in your book, but that's what a jongleur is. Now, the rest of the remaining paragraphs talks about troubadours and trouvères. And basically they're the same thing, but they just existed in northern and southern parts of Europe. And these are people who exist in the timeline after jongleurs. They're not coexisting. This comes from the root, from French, meaning to find. They were considered finders of words and rhymes and notes and things like that. They're not exactly a minstrel. They're more like somebody who was a poet and somebody who was a songwriter, and they weren't commoners. But they wouldn't be like the inheriting son or a very important daughter that would be married off. They would be the not inheriting son. They would be the clever one that's not going to get anything when father dies. And so they might take up this because they have an affinity for it. They could travel from place to place in Europe and be welcomed in other nobilities' castles and keeps and things, and they would also bring information. But they would have their poems read or sometimes sung by the minstrels. Very rarely, but sometimes they did actually perform. But many times they would show up and then get the court musicians to play or entertain on their pieces. One thing that's interesting about being a troubadour or a trouvère is if you were particularly good, you might be granted by one of your uncles or cousins or another nobility that you visited and shared your music and poems with, you might be granted an estate or a title or something more than what you were. And so this is one of the first times we find in not just music history but history in general where you can rise above your current station and elevate yourself because of your profession.